Good evening, Americans. This is your favorite alien here on the evening of Monday, July 19th, 2021, sitting here in my apartment of Orange City, Florida, Sparks of Spring Hill. Small little apartment, not much to look up. Sitting in for Paul Harvey this evening. Stand by for the rest of the story. Well, Americans, today's story is on the epidemic of drugs. According to sociologists, it probably happened in the 30s when people had to get something to get them through the day. It was tough enough as it was. So they went into all kinds of stuff. Herbs, and other stuff there, morphine here, herbs there. Well, the 40s came and war, the 50s, dissolution, and the 60s in war, and they needed more. You had soldiers that came in, used it to make themselves better, and they ended up fighting a war that they could never win for the rest of their lives once they got hooked. And they were into all kinds of things. Like I said, they were into herb, drugs, and pain drugs, all kinds of drugs. And the worst part about it is that the sociologists would probably say the 80s was the worst decade ever for drugs, where people were sitting out in the parks or wherever they were, the streets, home, in the bush, whatever, but they were all stoned with all kinds of drugs and new drugs that were coming along. In the 80s, you had elixirs that came out, and they started drinking them. And they had all these drugs in those so-called drinks that really caused them to be bad. In the society of the 80s, they would probably say, historians, wow, 100 years from now, they would say that the 80s was the big cause of this. All the epidemic that we're having. People dying left and right from nothing but drugs. And they would say, and here is the biggest time. The 80s was the cost of it. 50 years from now, 100 years from now, 150 years from now, they would probably say the 80s were causing it. Well, those people that wrote that in the 80s don't have an answer today. Almost 150 years later, for you see, Americans, the epidemic of your so-called drug abuse didn't happen in the 1930s, it happened in the 1830s. In the 80s, when the epidemic was really high, and they're talking about this, it's the 1880s. In the middle of the 1880s, Coca-Cola came into being, and it was made with cocaine. Up until that point, the other drugs, well, they didn't seem to have knowledge in there, cocaine was a deadly drug. 100 years later in the 1980s, when you had the same epidemic, and then you had AIDS epidemic that happened in the 1980s, and people were still using cocaine. Nothing changed in 100 years. But the war that they were talking about was the Civil War and the Mexican War of the 1840s, where, like they said, soldiers would come in and forever be fighting a war that they could never win. You're still fighting a war you could never win, because you use medications as a godsend. They used medication to escape their lives in the 1830s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. It was an escape mechanism. That they had there. They needed all those drugs, especially the pain drugs. Ether. And then they were experimenting with adrenaline that turned out to be deadly. So they stopped the adrenaline. Heck, they haven't even started with them yet. What are you going to do when you come with another drug in the next 5 years? Hyronalin, which will be fighting what you call radiation sickness. That's going to be happening soon. But you're still going to have your addiction to painkillers. Today, it's fentanyl. 150 years ago, it was morphine. Was the top killer. Then cocaine in the 1880s. And stayed that way till the 1980s, when fentanyl started showing up. Speaking as an alien from another planet, and Mr. Harvey, who did this program in the 1960s.